I'd like to introduce a very special guest here tonight. Her name is Hilda Salazar, and she's a longtime advocate of workers' rights and environmental protection in Mexico. Now she's working with a thought in Mexico, the Authentic Labor Front, which is the largest independent labor organization in Mexico, no small feat, in a country dominated by labor unions that are dominated by the corrupt government of Mexico. She's also now working with the Mexican Action Network on Free Trade, which is a coalition of over 100 organizations, labor, environmental, and other popular organizations that are working to define what fair trade should mean and working to negotiate those trade policies throughout the hemisphere. So please join me in welcoming our special guest tonight, Hilda Salazar.
Yeah.
Buenas noches.
Good evening.
Quisiera en primer lugar agradecer
I would first of all like to thank
al MIT y a las compañeras de casa por haberme invitado en esta ocasión
MIT and the compañeras from Casa for inviting me to address you on this occasion.
que es un tiempo muy importante porque estamos entrando a la recta final de aprobación del NAFTA.
This is a very important time because we're starting in the final approval process of NAFTA.
Pero también porque me siento muy honrada en compartir el auditorio
Also because I feel very honored to share this auditorium
del maestro Chomsky.
with Professor Chomsky.
Quisiera yo hablar de un punto de vista diferente al del gobierno mexicano en relación al Tratado de Libre
I
Comercio.
want to speak about a different viewpoint than the Mexican government has with relation to the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Y expresarles que hay una parte de la sociedad mexicana que no estamos de acuerdo con los términos actuales de ese
And
tratado.
express to you that there's a part of Mexican society that is not in agreement with the terms of that accord.
Yo pertenezco a una red de organizaciones sociales
I belong to a network of social organizations,
que tenemos 2 años trabajando en torno al NAFTA.
and we have been working for 2 years with regard to NAFTA.
El primer trabajo que nosotros hicimos fue tratar de averiguar qué estaba pasando con el acuerdo de comercio.
The first thing that we tried to do was try to find out what was happening with the Commerce Accord.
Cuando los gobiernos de Estados Unidos, México y Canadá anunciaron que se entraría en una negociación de un tratado de libre comercio,
When the governments of the United States, Canada, and Mexico announced that they were going to start dialogue about a free trade agreement,
y que fue dado con gran publicidad en nuestro país,
which was greeted with great publicity in our country,
al mismo tiempo empezamos a carecer de información concreta.
at the same time we started to suffer from a great lack of information.
El grueso de las negociaciones del tratado fueron hechas en secreto.
The majority of the negotiations were done in secret,
Acompañadas de una gran publicidad, pero carentes del contenido concreto de lo que se estaba
They were
negociando.
accompanied by a great deal of publicity which totally lacked content about what was being negotiated.
Por eso una de las primeras críticas que nosotros hacemos a este tratado
That's why one of our first criticisms of this treaty
es que no cuenta con un consenso social
is that it doesn't have a social consensus
ni de la sociedad de Estados Unidos, ni de Canadá y tampoco de México.
from U.S. society or Canadian society or Mexican society either.
En la búsqueda de esta información nosotros entramos en contacto con grupos de Canadá.
In search for this information, we have entered into contact with groups from Canada,
Y ellos nos contaron su experiencia en la firma de un tratado de libre comercio entre Estados Unidos y Canadá.
and they told us about their experience with regard to the signing of the treaty between Canada and the United States, the free trade agreement.
Y ellos confirmaron que gran parte de la sociedad canadiense había sido afectada por ese tratado.
And they confirmed to us that a great part of Canadian society was affected by that agreement,
Particularmente en lo que se refiere a sus empleos,
especially with regard to their jobs,
pero también en relación al medio ambiente.
but also with regard to the environment.
Empezamos entonces una lucha por tratar de conocer cuáles eran las negociaciones del tratado e influir en sus decisiones.
So we started to begin a struggle to understand the content of what was being negotiated in the treaty and to have an effect on those negotiations.
El Tratado de Libre Comercio para México empezó a adquirir más y más importancia.
The North American Free Trade Agreement started to have more and more importance.
Allá a estas alturas se ha convertido en la política macroeconómica más importante del gobierno de Salinas.
And at this point, it has become the most important macroeconomic politics or policy of the Salinas government.
No fue sino hasta año y medio después que nosotros pudimos acceder a un borrador del tratado.
It was not until a year and a half after it started that we could even get a rough draft of the treaty,
Y que nos fue proporcionado por compañeros de Estados Unidos y Canadá.
which was given to us by our colleagues in the United States and Canada.
De parte del gobierno mexicano no hemos podido todavía obtener información.
We still haven't been able to get information from the Mexican government.
Por lo tanto, consideramos que este acuerdo no solo no consultó organizaciones sociales, sino a otros sectores importantes de la sociedad.
That's why we think that this accord did not only consult with the popular organizations, but with society in general.
Una vez que conocimos su contenido, realizamos críticas al mismo.
Once we found out about the content of the accords or of the agreement, we made criticisms of said accords.
Pensamos que el Tratado de Libre Comercio va a beneficiar fundamentalmente al capital transnacional.
We think that the free trade agreement is principally going to benefit multinational capital.
Toda vez que no ha tomado en cuenta las grandes diferencias que existen entre nuestro país y Estados Unidos y Canadá.
It hasn't taken into account the great differences between our society and that of the United States and Canada.
Los pequeños y medianos industriales en México están preocupados también por el tratado.
Small and medium-sized entrepreneurs in Mexico are also very worried about the treaty.
Porque ellos no están preparados ni tecnológica, ni con capital, ni con capacitación suficiente para competir con estos capitales transnacionales.
Because they are not prepared with capital or with training or technology to compete with these transnational corporations.
Y es posible entonces que el empleo del que se habla que se va a crear en México con el Tratado de Libre Comercio,
And it's possible then that the jobs that they're talking about, which are going to be created with this free trade,
vaya acompañado también de grandes tasas de desempleo por estas industrias que van a quebrar.
will be accompanied by great unemployment in these industries that are going to go broke.
De hecho, en nuestro país durante este año han cerrado gran número de empresas manufactureras.
In fact, this year, many manufacturing companies in our country have closed
Porque no tienen suficiente calidad para competir con los productos que entran del extranjero.
because of a lack of ability or of quality standards to compete with products that come in from the exterior.
Otro asunto que nos pareció crucial en relación al texto del tratado es lo que se refiere a la agricultura.
Another crucial point which we considered in the agreement had to do with agriculture.
Fue pedido por muchas organizaciones campesinas que los granos básicos como el frijol y el maíz no entraran en la negociación del tratado.
Many campesino organizations, peasant organizations, asked or had the opinion that the issue of basic grains, beans, and rice should not be included in the dialogue for the agreement.
Porque se trata de un problema de autosuficiencia alimentaria y para muchos de ellos de subsistencia.
Because it's a problem of food self-sufficiency and for many of them subsistence.
Lo único que se logró en el cuerpo del tratado fue que para esos granos se dieran los plazos más largos, que son 15 años.
The only thing that was accomplished was that with regard to basic grains, there were longer time limits given, that is 15 years.
El funcionario encargado en México del programa social declaró recientemente
The official in Mexico in charge of the social program recently said
que se necesitarían 25 años para sacar al campo mexicano de la crisis en la que se encuentra.
That you would need 25 years to get the Mexican countryside out of the crisis in which it finds itself now.
De tal manera que el campesino mexicano va a llegar 10 años tarde al Tratado de Libre Comercio.
In such a manner, the campesino from Mexico is going to arrive at the the free trade agreement 10 years late.
En orden para enfrentar el Tratado de Libre Comercio, en mi país la Constitución ha sido cambiada en los últimos 2 años.
In order to deal with the free trade agreement, in the last 2 years in my country, the Constitution has been changed.
El tratado todavía no se aprueba y los cambios ya han sucedido en México.
The treaty has still not been approved, and the changes have already happened in Mexico.
Un cambio muy importante en nuestra legislación fue el artículo 27 que regula la propiedad de los recursos.
Important change is in the Article 27, which deals with
La propiedad de la tierra, el agua.
Land ownership or resource ownership.
Esos recursos llamados ejidos estaban en esa legislación en propiedad comunal y no podían ser vendidos ni enajenados.
Those properties which are called ejidos, according to the Constitution, could not be sold or expropriated.
Eran un patrimonio de la comunidad y ahora esos recursos pueden ser vendidos por la cabeza de familia.
They were a common heritage of the community, and now those properties can be sold by the head of household.
Es probable que las mejores tierras en México sí se vendan.
It's very probable that in this way the best lands in Mexico will be sold.
Pero las tierras de los estados más pobres van a permanecer en manos de los campesinos sin apoyo oficial.
But the lands of the poorest provinces will be still in the hands of the campesinos without any official support.
Porque la lógica de estas transformaciones es llevar a la eficiencia, a la competitividad, al libre mercado, la producción del campo mexicano.
Because the rationale is to bring to free trade, to competitiveness, the Mexican economy.
En cambio, el Tratado de Libre Comercio sí protegió los intereses de los grandes capitales en el capítulo de propiedad intelectual.
But on the other hand, the free trade agreement protected the interests of big capital in the area of intellectual property.
En este capítulo se tuvo mucho cuidado de que los dueños de las patentes, marcas y franquicias no entraran a una libertad y garantizar que la propiedad continuara.
In this respect, it was very carefully written that owners of patents, and royalties should keep their properties.
Tampoco considera el cuerpo del Tratado de Libre Comercio suficientemente aspectos sociales.
The Free Trade Agreement also does not adequately consider social concerns.
Nosotros hemos llamado esto la agenda social que debería estar incluida en el tratado.
We call this the social agenda which should be included within the agreement.
Un aspecto se refiere a las cuestiones laborales, a los derechos de los trabajadores.
One aspect is about labor issues, about workers' rights.
Otro se refiere al cuidado del medio ambiente.
Another aspect is the environment and care for the environment.
Nos parecía que el asunto de migración y de derechos humanos tendría que estar incluido también.
We believe also that issues of human rights and immigration should be included as well.
Recientemente se abrió la negociación de los acuerdos paralelos con respecto a la cuestión laboral y medio ambiente.
Recently, the labor and environment side agreement dialogue or negotiations were opened.
Nosotros pensamos que esta era una oportunidad para incluir estos aspectos que habían sido dejados fuera en el texto del tratado.
We thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to deal with these issues which had been left out of the text of the original treaty.
El resultado de estos acuerdos que conocimos el 12 de agosto nos parece totalmente insuficiente.
The results of these side agreements, which we found out about on the 12th of August, seems to us completely insufficient.
El acuerdo laboral se restringe solo a algunos aspectos.
The labor agreement is narrowed down only to certain limited aspects.
Se refiere a cuestiones de salud y seguridad.
It only deals with issues of health and security.
Trabajo de menores.
Child labor.
y salario mínimo.
and minimum wage.
Dejó fuera los derechos esenciales de los trabajadores, como el derecho de huelga,
It left out the essential rights of workers, such as the right to strike,
el derecho de contratación colectiva,
the right to collective bargaining,
la libertad sindical
the right of freedom of unions,
y en general las condiciones y prestaciones de los trabajadores.
and in general the issues of conditions of workers.
Pero además los mecanismos para resolver una controversia en los acuerdos paralelos
But the mechanism to resolve controversies within the side agreements
es muy complicado y muy burocratizado.
are very complicated and bureaucratic.
Y la participación de organizaciones civiles y sindicatos muy restringida.
And the participation of labor unions and civilian organizations within that is very restricted.
Lo mismo ocurre con el Tratado Ambiental,
The same is true with the environmental side agreement,
que contempla muchas disposiciones de carácter general,
which contemplates many very general themes,
que uno podría estar de acuerdo con ellas,
which one could be in agreement with,
pero la posibilidad de que sean aplicadas, particularmente en México, son muy remotas.
but the possibility of their being applied to specific situations in Mexico are very remote.
Tan remotas, remotísimas, como dijo el negociador Serrapuche,
So remote, so infinitely remote that, as the negotiator named Serrapuche
dijo
said,
que era la aplicación de sanciones en esta materia.
that it was like application of sanctions in this regard.
Cuando los grupos criticamos que hubieran aceptado sanciones comerciales.
When groups, ¿cómo es eso? When groups said that we would apply commercial sanctions.
Inicialmente el gobierno
boycott.
mexicano había declarado que no aceptaría sanciones comerciales,
The Mexican government said that it would not accept commercial sanctions
porque se trataba de un aspecto de soberanía nacional.
because it had to do with an issue of national sovereignty.
Finalmente, con la presión de la negociación, el gobierno mexicano aceptó sanciones comerciales.
Finally, with the pressure and negotiation, the Mexican government agreed to commercial sanctions.
Nosotros pensamos que el cuidado de los derechos laborales y del medio ambiente no es un problema de sanciones, sino de política económica.
We believe that the protection of labor rights and environmental rights are not an issue of sanctions, but an issue of economics and economic vitality.
Nuestra propuesta es que el tratado tal y como está negociado no sea ratificado por el Congreso de Estados Unidos,
Our proposal is that the agreement, as it is written now, not be ratified by the Congress of the United States,
ni por el Senado mexicano,
nor by the Mexican Senate.
que se abra una gran consulta nacional en los tres países,
There should be a great dialogue or consultation opened in all three countries,
y que los términos de un tratado de libre comercio
and the terms of the free trade agreement
sea discutido ampliamente con los sectores de la sociedad.
be discussed widely within all sectors of society.
No estamos en contra del libre comercio,
We are not against free trade.
estamos en contra de la forma como fue negociado.
We are against the manner in which it was negotiated.
Contaron mucho más los tiempos políticos que las consideraciones de carácter económico y social.
It had more to do with political issues of the time than issues of a social and economic nature.
Por ello nuestra propuesta es que no se apruebe este tratado,
That's why our proposal is that this treaty not be approved,
pero si no logramos que esto sea posible,
but if we do not accomplish this goal,
que los tres países tenemos que luchar por la inclusión de esta agenda social en las relaciones bilaterales y trilaterales.
the three countries together, we must work for this agenda, social agenda, to be included within the treaty on a bilateral basis as well as a trilateral basis.
Finalmente quisiera terminar externando una preocupación del debate actual en Estados Unidos.
Finally, I want to end with share with you a preoccupation that I have about the actual debate here within the United States.
Los que detractan el tratado, los que piensan que el tratado no debe aprobarse,
Those who are against the treaty, who believe that it shouldn't be approved,
están usando la idea de que los trabajadores mexicanos vamos a robar los empleos a los
are
estadounidenses.
using the rationale that we, the Mexican workers, are going to steal jobs from the United States.
En primer lugar, pensamos que las estimaciones han sido exageradas,
First of all, we believe that the calculations have been exaggerated.
tanto de pérdida de empleo de ustedes como de creación de empleo de nosotros.
Calculations about loss of jobs here as well as calculations about gain of jobs from us, on our part.
Pero que han sido usados argumentos de corte racista y muy proteccionista,
There have been arguments lodged which are very racist and very protectionist
tanto por ciertos grupos que están a favor como en contra del tratado.
by groups who are against as well as for the agreement.
Estamos aquí para comunicar que pensamos que podemos dar una lucha conjunta
We are here to communicate to you that we believe that we can forge a struggle together
y encontrar relaciones entre los tres países que sean benéficos para nuestros pueblos.
and thereby find relations within the three countries that will be beneficial to all of our peoples.
Estamos por una integración que contemple los intereses de los trabajadores de los tres países.
We
Muchas
are
gracias.
for an integration that contemplates the interests of workers in all three countries. Thank you very much.
For that message that has been so lost here in the United States. CASA will be traveling this week with Ilda Salazar to different places in the eastern Massachusetts area to bring that lost message to people and to the media here. Some places that you might go would be to the IUE Local 201 tomorrow in Lynn, or to Tufts University in the evening to get a more in-depth look at the environmental implications of both NAFTA and other free trade policies. Before I go any further, I'd like to invite Grant up to the podium. So welcome Grant to the podium.
Hi, I'm from the Thistle, and we reserved the room for this event. And I wanted to say that we recognize how important it is for forums like this to be held at MIT, how important it is for the MIT community and for the broader community. And we're going to work to keep MIT open to the Cambridge community and to energize the MIT community with the voices that are being heard tonight. Thank you.
The Thistle and MIT Initiative for Peace have both been very supportive of CASA's work in the past and of all progressive causes here in the area. The Thistle is an incredible university progressive paper, and it's not just for students at MIT, and it's widely available at locations. Well, what can I think of it's available? I get it at the Harvest Food Co-op, and you could also ask Grant or somebody else from the Thistle here where you can get that newspaper. It's incredible. So thanks again to the Thistle for helping us get this room this evening. And now I'd like to introduce to you the man who really, I think, needs no introduction. Noam Chomsky is one of the brilliant minds of our time, not on one issue, but on a variety of issues. Here at MIT, he's a professor of linguistics and has done groundbreaking work in that field. Many of us, though, know him for his analysis on U.S. imperialism in Central America, in the Middle East, and throughout the globe. We know him for his analysis about the media, his analysis that helps us to evaluate what the media covers and why they cover what they cover and why they leave out what they leave out. Many of us know him for his writings, Manufacturing Consent, Year 501, The Conquest Continues, and now many of us know him because he's a film star. Manufacturing Consent, again, is a film that puts together many of the ideas of Noam Chomsky, and if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to watch that film. On behalf of CASA, I'm very honored to welcome Noam Chomsky here tonight. CASA is very grateful that Noam Chomsky again has agreed to do a benefit for CASA and to talk about the issues that are very important to CASA and to the hemisphere. Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky.
Kind of disappointed that you didn't mention the achievement that I'm most proud of. I got on the back of a punk rock record, sharing it with Bad Religion. I thought that was pretty. When I'm asked to talk about topics like tonight's topic, at least what the topic that was announced in the thistle, where I get all my information from, as everyone should, democracy and free trade. The first thing that comes to mind almost inevitably is a story about Mahatma Gandhi, who was asked once what he thought about Western civilization. And he thought for a while, and he answered that he thought it might be a good idea. And I have no idea whether the story is true or not, but it's a nice story anyway. And it certainly applies to the question of free trade and democracy. They might, in fact, be good ideas. There has, over the centuries, been an expansion of democratic participation. In my opinion, it's stopped and it's being reversed. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think it would be a good idea to press forward with that project, which is now facing great problems around the world, I think. With regard to free trade, we're basically talking about nothing. Nobody's in favor of free trade except for maybe somebody else, because then you can plunder them better if they accept those rules. Surely no developed society has ever followed such rules, including the United States, ever in the past or in the present. As for a North American free trade agreement, that might be a good idea. But NAFTA has nothing to do with that, or almost nothing to do with that. It is North American, that's true. It's North American, but it's not free. It's not about free interaction, it's not about trade, and it certainly doesn't have much agreement behind it. In fact, the populations of the country seem to be overwhelmingly against it. So a North American free trade agreement might be something interesting to talk about, and democracy is certainly interesting to talk about, and the connections between democracy and free trade are also worth talking about, but now we'd be, like some academic seminar about some topic that doesn't exist. In the real world, things are a little different. Now, it's not that democracy and free trade aren't words that are bandied about constantly. They certainly are. For example, if you subject yourselves, as I do for some masochistic reason, to reading the New York Times every morning, the last couple of days have been full of, last week have been full of discussion of something called the New Clinton Doctrine. The New Clinton Doctrine, surely it's all about free trade and democracy. If you read, there was a major speech given by the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, a lot of articles about it, and so on. Apparently something really important is going on, to judge by the headlines, headlines like U.S. vision of foreign policy reversed, not just modified, but actually reversed. And the doctrine, the New Clinton Doctrine, is certainly involves at least a rhetorical commitment to democracy and free trade. It opens as follows. It says, I'll quote the actual words, throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracies. Now we should seek to enlarge their reach. Okay, so that's the reversal. Up until now, we were containing a global threat to democracy and free trade. Now we are going to enlarge the reach of democracy and free trade. The key words to remember for those of you who want to get jobs and things is that we used to believe in containment, and now we believe in enlargement. That's the reversal. Well, it's an interesting comment. We can try to evaluate it. And a rational person would know exactly how to do it. So a rational person who wanted to find out, say, let's begin with the first part. Throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracies. A rational person who wanted to find out, say, what pre-Gorbachev Russia was doing during the Cold War would begin by asking what they did do. For example, specifically in regions that were under their influence and control. So you want to find out what they were trying to do, you look at what they did do in Eastern Europe, for example. That tells you what you're trying to do, if you're rational. Similarly, a rational person who's trying to figure out what the United States was trying to do through the Cold War, throughout the Cold War, would take a look at what it did do, particularly in areas which are under its influence and domination. Well, that's a much wider arena for us than it is for pre-Gorbachev Russia, but there's plenty of evidence in it, and there are some parts that are plainly decisive to answer these questions, certainly for a rational person. The obvious place to look is Latin America, which has been almost totally under our domination and control with no interfering factors since the Second World War, and for the Caribbean region from far beyond that. So that's where you would look to find out about our containing a global threat to democracy and markets. So, for example, start with just the most important case. The most important country in Latin America, the biggest, the richest, and so on, is Brazil. And according to this doctrine then, when the Kennedy administration dedicated itself to overthrowing the parliamentary government in Brazil in the early 1960s, and then the Johnson administration picked it up, instituting a regime of neo-Nazi fascist torturers and killers, national security state. The reason they did that was because they wanted to defend democracy and markets. That's what we're told to believe. And in fact, that's pretty much what was believed, or at least what was said. So, for example, Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, when the generals took over, said that he praised what he called this democratic revolution, which he called a great victory for the free world. In fact, the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century. This is while the torturers and the killers were very visibly at work. He also added another line which helps explain what this is about. He said that this is a great victory for the free world, which should create a greatly improved climate for foreign investment. Well, that suggests something. In fact, it did create a greatly improved climate for foreign investment. To call it a victory for freedom and democracy requires a rather special understanding of those words. As the fascist terror was imposed with greater violence and destruction in Brazil in the following years, Brazil became, quoting, the Latin American darling of the business community. That's quoting the business press, and it's quite accurate. It is true that there were some reservations about the sadistic violence with which the improvement in the investment climate was being carried out, but it was indeed the Latin American darling of the business community. There was nothing particularly new about that. The same had been true about Mussolini's Italy and about Hitler Germany. So in the 1920s, when the black shirts took over Italy, they were highly praised also for carrying out a great revolution that we highly praised. A decade later, President Roosevelt praised the admirable Italian gentleman who'd carried it out, destroying the labor movement and eliminating the parliamentary system, instituting torture and terror, but improving investment opportunities, no question. In fact, U.S. investment in Italy just shot up in the 1920s. The business press was absolutely rhapsodic about it. In Fortune magazine, in around 1932, actually had a full issue devoted to it, which had on the front cover a big slogan, "The Wops are unwopping themselves." The Wops are finally getting something right. That's the idea. When Hitler came along in the 1930s, he too was lauded. We had to support him as a barrier to, barrier to communist takeover. And in fact, American business investment in Germany boomed through the 1930s. It leveled in it declined in most of the rest of Europe, leveled in England, greatly expanded in Germany because Nazi Germany was the darling of the business community. So there's nothing novel about the support for the Brazilian neo-Nazis, both the attempt to institute a neo-Nazi military coup that would eliminate the parliamentary regime under Kennedy, and then the support for it in later years. Well, Brazil's a particularly interesting case. For one thing, it's the biggest and richest country in Latin America. It's a country with enormous prospects. I mean, it's tremendous advantages, enormous resources, no foreign enemies, wonderful relations with the major sources of capital. It's been under firm U.S. control for about almost 50 years now, so it had the advantages of our guidance and tutelage. In fact, you can find out a lot about us by seeing what happened there. If you look at the numbers, it looks pretty successful. It has one of the fastest growth rates in the world, in fact. If you look at profits for foreign investors, they're fantastic. If you keep to something like, say, 5 or 10% of the population of Brazil, looks great too. They live like rich, Western Europeans and New Yorkers. If you bother looking at the other 80% or so, well, sort of down in Central Africa. In fact, this super rich country with extraordinary advantages was ranked recently by the UN Report on Human Development in 80th place, right next to Albania and Paraguay. Well, what developed in Brazil is in fact what develops under the particular form of market democracy that we have advocated and in fact instituted, namely a two-tiered society, radically split, between a small sector linked to international business and investors, which does very nicely, and a huge mass of essentially superfluous people who survive as they can. In Brazil, not very well. Hundreds of thousands of children die of starvation every year. Medical researchers in Brazil have identified what they regard as a new species, 40% the brain size of humans, after actually generations of starvation. These are in perfectly fertile areas, except where the land is monopolized for agro-export in accordance with the most best approved neoliberal models. And if anybody tries to get into it, there's always the security forces to keep them out. Brazil wins many prizes, for example, in murder of street children by the security forces, in child slavery, if you can believe Brazilian authorities who are investigating this, in killing of children for the purposes of organ transplant, as is very firmly believed, I should say, by analysts there, although it's a little hard to believe. But it's, in many respects, it's doing very nicely, and it tells us a lot about ourselves. In fact, if you look at the monographic literature in Brazil, it's regarded as a success. So, for example, the senior historian of the CIA, Gerald Haynes, has a highly regarded monograph that came out about a year or two ago where he calls this, he points out that when the U.S. took over Brazil in 1945, it was going to be a testing area for scientific methods of development, and we're going to show them how to do things. Writing in 1989, he says this is a grand success story for American capitalism, worked out just the way we want it. So if a rational person would look at that and say, well, that tells us something about the way we've been containing a global threat to market democracies throughout the Cold War. Well, perhaps Brazil is unusual for some reason. So we could look at other cases, like we could look at how we defended democracy in Guatemala or Chile and a whole list of other places, and I won't waste your time on it because you know what we'll find. We can look at other things, which are in a way even more revealing and not quite so much on the surface. So a couple of days ago, I think 2 or 3 days ago, I forgot, the World Bank came out with a new report on Latin America, which was quite ominous from their point of view. They predicted it's heading for a disaster. If you read the the business pages that are euphoric about the great growth in the stock market and so on. But the World Bank found something else. They found that Latin America has the worst record of inequality in the world. No other area comes close, and in fact they predict that this is going to lead to chaos and destruction unless governments intervene somehow to do something about it. Well, why does Latin America have the worst record of inequality in the world, meaning the sharpest division of this two-tiered society between the tiny sector of very rich and the mass of very poor? Certainly Mexico is a perfect example of this. The economic miracle in Mexico in the last 10 years, economic miracle is a technical term, which means the macroeconomic statistics look nice and the population is dying. That's what's called an economic miracle, and Mexico is an example. The part of the economic miracle that very much impresses foreign investors and industrialists is, for example, that they've managed to knock the wages down about 60%. The labor share of income in Mexico over the economic miracle has gone down by, probably 25% or something like that. And the stock market, in fact, is doing great, except 95% of the shares are owned by 8,000 people, of whom 1,500 are foreigners. That's the two-tiered third world model. Very successful, but the World Bank is worried because the radical maldistribution of wealth, which has become far more serious in recent years, they think is going to have chaotic effects. Why did that happen? Is it something in the Latin American genes, perhaps, hence not a consequence of the fact that we've been essentially running that place throughout the Cold War? Well, you can get the answer to that too, but here you have to look a little harder. The U.S. took over Latin America in 1945. Literally took it over. Finally, the U.S. was powerful enough in 1945 to achieve the goals of the Monroe Doctrine. Before that, it had been mostly words, except for the local region. That meant we had to throw out our enemies. Our enemies were Britain and France. We kicked them out. And we took it over for ourselves, and as Haynes says, turned it into a testing area for scientific methods of development by the methods of capitalism and markets, with the results you see. Well, exactly after we kicked out the French and British, there was still, a lot of other people to worry about, those guys who lived down there, and they happened to have some ideas of their own. Their ideas were described, in fact, by the U.S. State Department in internal records, now, of course, declassified. And the State Department was much concerned about what was going on in the minds of the peons down there, because the governments who are by no means radical, I should say, but nevertheless, the governments were committed to what the State Department called the philosophy of the new nationalism, or otherwise called economic nationalism. And the principles of the philosophy of new nationalism were that governments should work for improvement of production for domestic needs, for broader distribution of wealth, for raising of the standard of living of the masses, and should adopt the principle that the first beneficiaries of a nation's wealth should be its own population. Those are quotes. That's the philosophy of the new nationalism, and obviously that won't do. They got the wrong idea. They don't understand the principles of economic rationalism that you sort of learn in your economics courses. The right principles were presented in the U.S. proposal called an Economic Charter for the Americas, which said that we must end economic nationalism in all its forms, meaning the first beneficiaries of a nation's wealth are foreign investors, not the people of that country. No nonsense about distribution of labor, of wealth. No priorities for development for internal needs and so on. Rather, we follow the sacred doctrines of comparative advantage and international specialization, and it's easy to prove a theorem if you've gone to places like MIT that says that the total efficiency of production increases if Brazil develops in a way which is complementary to the United States. In other words, we should produce the manufacturers and the steel and so on, and they should put out, give us raw materials and some cheap labor, and maybe they can do some industrial work, but only the kind that doesn't interfere with us, like, steel industry, but on kind of stuff we're not that much interested in. Interestingly, they were allowed to compete with Europe and Canada. That wasn't against the techniques, the principles of economic rationalism, but they had to be complementary to us, and in particular, no economic nationalism. None of these irrational ideas about the first beneficiaries of the development programs in a country being the people of that country, because they're obviously the foreign investors. Well, the results of all of that, those programs, the United States, of course, won that conflict. Our power was overwhelming, and one of the end results is given to you in the World Bank report several days ago, namely the worst income distribution in the world, because that's exactly what we instituted, policies leading to that in the Economic Charter for the Americas in February 1945 in a hemispheric meeting in Mexico. Well, you might ask whether any of this has changed. Throughout this whole period, it is certainly true that we have sought a particular style of market economy, particular style, certainly not democracy. I'll drop that. But you might suppose one would argue, well, that's just ancient history. When the Clinton administration is talking about what we've done throughout the Cold War, they really mean, say, the last few years. So one can look, say, at the 1980s. How did we protect market democracies in our domains in the 1980s? Our domains, again, the obvious place to look is Latin America, though I should say everything I'm saying generalizes worldwide. It just gets more complicated when you move to places where the United States wasn't completely free to do anything it wanted, and there were some conflicting problems they had to worry about. So you want to look at a pure case, clear case, what we really are, you look at Latin America, if you're rational. Well, instead of giving you my opinion about our attitudes toward democracy in the 80s, let me quote, see how it looks like from the point of view of a Reagan insider, a Reagan official in the State Department, who has written, in fact, quite extensively, one of the main people who's written on U.S. Efforts to bring democracy to Latin America under the Reagan administration, Thomas Carruthers of the State Department, who was a Reagan official with regard for Latin America through the 1980s. Actually what he writes is very good. I recommend it. He finds, and honest also, he finds a correlation between U.S. influence and democracy. Indeed, there is a correlation, sharply negative. That is, the greater, and he says so, the greater U.S. influence, the less the democracy. So there was a democratizing development in Latin America down in the Southern Cone, where our influence was least. And furthermore, the Reagan administration was opposed to it and tried to block it, finally sort of went along with it when it was happening anyway. On the other hand, in the places where our influence was strong, the move was quite in the opposite direction, as he points out, an attack on democracy in any meaningful sense, at least. And he then draws a more general conclusion. He says that the United States did adopt pro-democracy policies, but as a means of relieving pressure for more radical change, and it inevitably sought only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. Okay, that tells you what, that's true, tells you what democracy is. Democracy means you keep the structure of power, you keep the guys in charge who are going to create a good climate for business operations, and that's democracy. That's what makes Boris Yeltsin a Democrat when he throws out the Constitution and so on, because he's a Democrat in just this sense. He's helping impose a top-down structure of power, which will, in fact, do things like improving, they hope at least, improving the climate for business opportunity. That makes him a Democrat. And in that sense, in the sense that Carruthers describes, it's indeed true that we've been protecting democracy and containing the threat to it throughout the Cold War years. I haven't said anything yet about this global threat that we've been containing, and we can look at that in Latin America too. So take, say, again, Brazil. U.S. intelligence, of course, was much concerned about communist infiltration. They never could find any Russians. If you look through the intelligence record, the Russians weren't trying to get in, as if it would have been possible for them to get in. So they never found any Russians. And in fact, if you look through the whole hemisphere, that generalizes. The only time the Russians are visibly there is when we virtually invited them in. If you attack some country and you try to destroy it, people there are going to seek some help somewhere, and inevitably they're going to turn to the Russians. So in that sense, the Russians were there, an equivalent of, say, Anthony Lake and other people who talk about the global threat of the Russians. A Soviet equivalent of that would be somebody who would write, for example, that in Afghanistan, the United States was defending freedom and democracy from the global threat of American imperialism, using as the basis for that the fact that the United States, for its own cynical reasons, supported resistance to the Russian aggression, just as the Russians, for their own cynical reasons, supported resistance to U.S. attack. That's the only sense in which there was any global threat in Latin America. Well, what about the matter of indigenous communists? Here there's a lot more to say. For example, you might raise questions about why suppressing indigenous communists has anything to do with protecting democracy. But putting that aside, what you have to ask is, the first question to ask is exactly what is meant when people talk about indigenous communists. And again, the record tells you pretty clearly what is meant. So, for example, Eisenhower and Dulles deplored the fact that in Latin America and in fact elsewhere, the communists are, I'm quoting them, the communists are able to appeal directly to the masses. They have an ability to get control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. So we've got this mass of poor people. That's a big problem of modern history, all history. You know, you've got all those poor people out there. They're always trying to plunder the rich, and somehow the communists are able to appeal to them. We don't seem to be able to do that. We can't sell our own line that the rich should plunder the poor, kind of PR problem, you know, hire Edward Bernays or something like that. But that's the problem. From that point of view, there are indeed many communists all over the place. Then you got to keep cutting them down, you know, and you've got to keep containing that threat, especially because there's huge mass of poor people everywhere trying to plunder the rich, and all these guys appealing to them. I mean, that's exactly why, say, you know, a priest organizing a Bible study group in El Salvador became a communist. He was trying to help the poor take control over their lives and so on, which would mean plundering the rich, who own everything by right. It's why a couple of days ago, the U.S. Senate, by a vote of nearly 94-4, voted not to permit any further aid to go to Nicaragua, unless Nicaragua returns the properties of Somozas. What they say is American citizens whose properties were confiscated. But American citizens whose properties were confiscated are people who attained their wealth and property by participating in the robbery and the destruction of Nicaragua for years under programs like the Alliance for Progress. Somoza was also considered an economic miracle, except by the population. When they finally rose up and these properties were taken away, that's obviously a crime. They were plundering the rich. And unless Nicaragua stops that crime and allows the rich to plunder the poor properly, they're not going to get aid from us. Well, you know, the depravity of this, in order to understand it, you have to remember the background. We, after all, destroyed the country. We spent years running a murderous terrorist war in which tens of thousands of people were slaughtered, and now, in fact, the country is down to the level of Haiti, literally. There are tens of thousands of children dying in the streets. They, in fact, appealed to the World Court and won a court case against us and had a claim to reparations, but we kept the stranglehold on and said, drop that claim or you're dead. They finally dropped the claim under an arrangement by which the U.S. guaranteed to give them aid. Little fact which has yet to make it into the newspapers. On that condition, they dropped the claim. We now cancel the aid because they're still helping the poor plunder the rich. Well, that's the sense in which we've been defending the market and democracies from the communist threat. I can go on with many more examples, and you can too, so I won't bother anymore with that. But just make an interesting, what seems to me an interesting comment about our intellectual culture, the one in which we live. people can read and write about our long-term policies of defending market democracy, and they can do it without laughing, without bursting out in hysterical laughter. And that's an interesting fact, actually, because in order to be able to do that, you have to eliminate from your mind questions that would arise in the mind of any intelligent 10-year-old, like the ones I've asked. If we've been defending the threat of if we've been defending market democracy from a global threat of communism, let's look at the facts, let's look at the cases and see how we did it, say in Brazil or Guatemala and Chile and Nicaragua and so on. Of course, as soon as you ask that question, the whole story collapses. But to maintain it, you just have to be sure you never ask the question. And it takes some doing to do that. You have to respect people who are able to do that, not to ask the kind of question that any child would think of in 3 seconds, and that we would instantly think of with regard to any other country. It takes quite a good educational system, places like MIT and Harvard and everything like it, to ensure that people are so totally deprived of the capacity to think that they can write sentences like that and read sentences like that, and it can never occur to them to ask the simplest, most elementary question, which suffices, in fact, to make the whole thing collapse into hilarious laughter. Well, that's an achievement, and there aren't many countries that have done it, especially under conditions of freedom, maybe none, so we ought to be proud of ourselves. Well, let's drop the fraud about democracy and look at the market. There's some more interesting things to say, and we can go back to Lincoln Gordon, the Kennedy-Johnson representative in Brazil, who was telling us about the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, and pointing out that this ought to improve the climate for foreign investment. Now, when we say that U.S. policy has been an effort to improve the market in that sense, it's at least partially true. Now we're entering the real world, but still only partially. What's true is that we do try to force, and given our power, succeed in forcing the third world. The third world now includes Eastern Europe, back to its traditional third world status. That's basically what the Cold War was about. We do, in fact, try to impose upon the third world, and ultimately succeed, given the distribution of power. We try to force them to adopt market economies, and we do this with many impressive pieties about the marvels of the free market, and if you're big intellectual, you talk about the comparative advantage and specialization and efficiency and all that kind of stuff that you know about. That's for others, however. That's where the story ends. That's for others, not for us. We don't believe in the market for ourselves, and we never have. NAFTA, which I'll get to in a moment, is a case in point. It's interesting that people who really do believe in free trade, there's a few of them out there, are generally opposed to NAFTA because it's so highly protectionist. In fact, and if you listen to American corporation executives, they're for NAFTA for exactly that reason. I'll come back to that. In any event, it's typical in that we have never accepted free trade for ourselves. It's something for other people to follow. You get a good example in this morning's New York Times. Might as well be up to the minute. If you take a look at the business section on the front page, there's an article about another new Clinton policy. In addition to the reversal of our vision on foreign policy, we have what's called a new national export strategy. And if you read the article, you'll discover that the new national export strategy goes far beyond, I'm quoting the article, the less coordinated efforts of Reagan and Bush. They had a national export strategy, but now we're going to go way beyond it and have a more coordinated one. Not mentioned in this article, and probably never reported there, is that the national export strategy of Reagan and Bush were in violation of the rules of GATT, the international trading rules, because they were illegal subsidies. And in fact, that was conceded by the U.S. government. The head of the Export-Import Bank, federal agency that deals with these things, conceded that the export strategy, which was involved subsidies to U.S. corporations operating abroad, was in violation of the GATT rules. So therefore, the new export strategy, which goes way beyond the old one, is going to be radically in violation of the GATT rules. That is, radically in violation of free trade. The conceded violation during the Reagan years was part of the extreme attack on economic liberalism that was carried out by the Reagan administration, which combined two things. One, the highest level of rhetoric and memory about the wonders of free trade, and two, the sharpest attack on those principles in memory. In fact, James Baker, when he was Secretary of Treasury, pointed out quite accurately that the Reagan administration had offered more protection to American industrialists than all preceding post-war generations, which is quite true. For example, by virtually doubling the percentage of imports subject to one or another form of barrier. In fact, they invented all kinds of new tricks to do this. But it wasn't enough, and now we have to go well beyond. And it's quite interesting to read the discussion. You read the discussion about it in, say, this morning's Times, you get a lot of insight into what markets are and are intended to be. So the government, the U.S. government and the New York Times concede that we oppose the policies that we are now going to implement even more fully than before, and we oppose them because they amount to government subsidies that distort international markets. I'm quoting, and we're very much against that, as you know. That's why we're implementing the policy. Well, we're against it when other people carry out those policies, but it's right for us to carry them out. And in fact, that's explained. Here's the explanation, quoting the president of the Export-Import Bank. You gotta listen to this carefully, it's kind of subtle. By creating such a program in the United States, the Clinton administration will have more influence in seeking international limits on such programs. Get it? We're opposed to the programs because we're big, free trade exponents. Therefore, we will institute programs which radically violate free trade, because once we've done it, we'll be in a better position to influence others to drop the programs that we're opposed to. Well, those of you who sort of follow these games will recognize the logic perfectly. There's a whole history of being in favor of war because it's going to bring peace, or being in favor of crime because it's going to bring about law-abiding behavior, or being in favor of increase in military production and arms exports because it's going to lead to a decline in military spending worldwide, and so on. You're all familiar with that, and this is just another example. And you could put the thing in simple words. In simple words, it would say approximately anything goes as long as there's a good answer to the question, what's in it for us? Now, I didn't invent that nice phrase. I stole it from the Clinton administration and the New York Times, and it has to do with another aspect of the new Clinton doctrine, which has just been put forth. In fact, it was presented the day after the U.S. vision of foreign policy reversed. It was a report on a White House panel on intervention, which came up with a new proposal on it. We're going to have a new policy on intervention. The policy is, what is in it for us? Those are the words that are highlighted. In other words, we're going to abandon the altruism of the past when we turn large parts of the world into graveyards and deserts, and from now on we're going to ask, what's in it for us? That's the new vision. I also didn't quite give you the full report. The full report on the U.S. vision of foreign policy reversed. I only quoted you some of the lines. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, who wrote that article under the heading U.S. Vision of Foreign Policy Reversed, Thomas Friedman, he said the essence of the new policy is this: with the Soviet nuclear threat gone, where and how we intervene abroad is a matter of choice. That's the essence of it. In other words, now we understand what the global threat was. They had a deterrent, and that prevented us from choosing where and how we were going to intervene. But now that the deterrent is gone, we really can reverse our policy. Now we can intervene where and how we like, and we will do it when there's something in it for us. That's the two new policies. I think the technical term for that is politics of meaning, if I've understood modern discourse properly. Well, actually, there's absolutely nothing new in any of this, except one thing. The U.S. really does have greater freedom, has greater freedom to use its resources of violence and terror to get what's in it for us. And we have to qualify a little, and I will in a moment, about what's meant by us, but let's hold that in the background for a minute. Well, let's return to our attitude toward markets. Again, the New York Times is very helpful about this. They're very worried about the popular opposition to NAFTA. They don't like it. They figure they're going to ram it right through. It was all done in secret. Nobody ever heard about it. Just as you heard, same in the United States. It was kept secret. But somehow, popular groups got wind of it and didn't like what they heard, and they made a fuss. So now you got a problem. So the New York Times, as its contribution to overcoming the problem, published on the front page what they called a primer on free trade, written by their economics correspondent, which is going to explain to sort of the ignorant fools why free trade is a good idea. And they had a couple hundred economists who signed a statement, and they quoted all the fancy big shots, including the ones here and everyone else. And the basic idea that came out was that it's been understood for 250 years that free trade leads to a more efficient employment of productive forces. And in fact, you actually can prove a theorem to that effect under certain conditions, so the statement is true. And in fact, it's been true for 250 years. For example, it was true in the early 19th century, when the United States began its development as an industrial economy, and right around here, places like Lowell and Lynn and so on set up textile factories, which of course couldn't begin to compete with British textiles, so therefore you had to set up very high protectionist barriers to allow them to develop. And when they did develop, in radical violation of the most efficient employment of productive resources, the lesson that was understood then as well as it is now, that had side effects. I mean, after textiles, you had small industries that were producing for the textile factories and so on. And by radically violating sound economic thinking, the United States was able to begin its economic takeoff. Actually, this wildly understates the point. Remember that the Industrial Revolution was based on King Cotton, and remember how cotton became king. First by exterminating the indigenous population by state violence, and then by slavery. Well, that's a rather serious intervention with free market forces. In both cases, the state was sort of doing something besides just kind of watching while the free market operates. But let's put aside King Cotton, which nobody talks about, and just look at the protectionist barriers. I mean, there are economic historians who look at these things, and they've estimated that about 50% of New England industry, meaning U.S. industry, that's all there was, New England industry in the, say, 1820s and 1830s, about 50% of it would have gone bankrupt instantly if they had dropped the protective tariffs. Now, it's not that anything changed later on. Later on in the century, things changed. We now have railroads and stuff, want to develop the steel industry. Well, you can't compete with cheaper British steel. So therefore, high protective tariffs were set up to create the barriers that would permit Andrew Carnegie to set up the world's first billion-dollar corporation, U.S. Steel. He also got a little help from the state in other ways, like sending in the National Guard to smash up workers who tried to keep their jobs. That's another way in which the state helped. And if you come up to the present, the story is exactly the same. I mean, everybody's got a computer on their desk. Why do you have a computer? Because the public paid 100% of the costs of research and development in the 1950s when computers were too big and clumsy to sell. That's called the Pentagon. That's the funnel by which the public funds research and development and production, in fact, creating a market for it if you can't sell it, because it's useful. It's called the Pentagon system. It includes, NASA, men on the moon and all this sort of business, and the Department of Energy and so on. There's a network. That's our massive form of intervention in the market, which in fact gives you things like electronics industries and computers and massive parallel processing in the last couple of years, which is a military production, lasers, pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical industry works this way. In fact, everything does. It's hard to find a sector of the economy which isn't profitable because the public has paid the costs via the government in some fashion, the Pentagon or something else, and then if something turned out to be marketable, you give it to private enterprise, and then they make the profits. So you socialize the costs and you privatize the profits. It's called free enterprise, and it's done via radical state intervention. That's quite aside from things like protectionist barriers. We had a terrible record of protectionism right through the 1980s, when in fact the U.S. led the way, and so on. Well, that was the United States. Are other countries different? No, they're all exactly the same. As far as I know, without a single exception, every country that developed did it this way. And that goes back to England, the guy who started it off. They were able to develop by smashing up Indian industry, which was competitive with them in textiles, in manufacturing, building ships, all this sort of thing. But the British happened to have the guns, so they could destroy it. And they did. They destroyed it with things very similar to what we now call free market experiments. Well, you see the result. India deindustrialized, became more agricultural, became a deeply impoverished agricultural country by the time the British got out. England industrialized. They were aware of it. You can read discussions in the House of Lords in 1850 saying that Dhaka, the Manchester of England, is now becoming a desert and a slum. Dhaka is now the capital of Bangladesh, a symbol of misery. When the British came in, it was regarded as a paradise. Populous, wealthy, very not only agricultural and other resources, but industry by the standards of the day. Now it's Bangladesh. Actually, Haiti is exactly the same. It was also one of the first places, actually the first place colonized. It's where Columbus landed, and again described as a paradise. Perhaps the most populated area of the world. Very rich, lots of resources. I mean, it helped lay the basis for the wealth of France and Britain, ended up being Haiti. Well, that story is duplicated all throughout the world. And there's some perfectly obvious lessons of economic history there. You want to develop, you'll do it this way. Follow the free market, and you'll end up like the British experiment in Bengal, or the local equivalent today. That's maybe the clearest lesson of economic history, and it explains why there's a kind of a double-edged attitude toward markets. Markets are fetters for the weak. The rich cast them off when they feel like it. There are times when the rich are willing to play with markets, namely when they're going to win. So, for example, Britain, which is a classic case, while they were developing their own industrial system, they smashed Indian industry, they actually smashed Egyptian industry and others. They weren't able to smash the United States because we were too strong. We had too many guns here, so we could keep them out. That way they were able to develop. By about the middle of the 19th century, they figured they could probably win. They were so far ahead of anybody else, they became enthusiastic advocates of free trade, and they stayed that way until they started running into Japanese competition in the 1920s, which they couldn't deal with. So they just closed off the empire. In 1932, the British essentially closed the empire to Japanese penetration, and that's one of the factors that led to the Second World War. And that's the way it is. If you're going to win, you like markets. If you're not going to win, you don't like them. What's in it for us is the question that's asked. In the last decade, the rich countries, the OECD countries, have become considerably more protectionist. Almost all of them. The United States most extreme in many ways, but all of them have become more protectionist. The third world, in contrast, has been subjected to what's called structural adjustment. About 75 countries have been subjected to these neoliberal market experiments, and the results were completely predictable from a couple hundred years of history, but now they're in. The gap between the richest countries and the poorest countries has approximately doubled. And for very clear reasons, not a big surprise. Going back to the primer in the New York Times, there's a few things that were not there, surprisingly, like, for example, the things I've talked about. I mean, if these principles are immutable laws, then how come they didn't apply throughout all of American history? How come why don't we conclude that the way things should have worked is that people like us ought to be pursuing our comparative advantage in exporting fur, while India, or maybe Egypt, or some other place should have been leading the Industrial Revolution, which is quite possibly what would have happened if market principles had applied. But the guys with the guns, we're not going to let them apply. And therefore, we're us, and India's India, and Egypt's Egypt, and so on. Well, that's the way things have worked. And there are consequences right up until today, like take India, big country, a lot of potential. And they do lots of things quite well. For example, 7 out of 10 diamonds in the world are cut in India. They're really good at that. It's quite profitable, too, because you can use super cheap labor, in places where you can get workers for like nothing, and then if they die, which they do pretty soon, they got plenty more of them. This is one of the results of the neoliberal programs that have been, in fact, this has been improving over the last 10 years thanks to these programs that India has been forced to adopt. And that has benefits, got its bright side. The bright side was described recently by a diamond exporter who said, we pass along some of the benefits to our overseas customers. The benefits are that now the extremely impoverished Indian workers are working for a fraction of what they used to, thanks to the neoliberal programs, and we pass on those benefits so people benefit from them. What happens is the workers in India and their families starve to death in the New World Order of economic rationalism, but diamond necklaces are cheaper in elegant shops in downtown Boston and so on. That's called economic rationalism, and that's in fact what you taught by the primer that the New York Times had in the front page, but somehow these facts didn't seem to be there. I wonder why. Now, so far everything I've said has been a total mystification, and let me clear that up. I've been talking as if nations are agents in world affairs, talking about what we do and what they do and so on. And of course that's not true. In fact, I mentioned, say, these UN statistics on the doubling of the gap between the richest and the poorest countries in the last 30 years. If you look at the richest, you take the same statistics and you look at the richest and the poorest people, across the countries, you find that the gap didn't just double, it went far higher. The gap between the richest and the poorest people went far higher, and in fact, about half of that gap is internal to particular countries, meaning the poor got poorer in the rich countries, and they got a lot poorer in the poor countries, and the rich got richer in the rich countries, and the rich got richer in the poor countries. That's what actually happened. Now, all of this has to do with sort of a trivial fact. Namely, nations aren't actors, countries aren't actors. Rather, in any state, any country in which there's an internal concentration of power of any kind, you can pretty well predict that the policy of that state is going to reflect the people who have the internal power. It's going to reflect their interests. It's known as class analysis. It was described quite eloquently by that famous radical Marxist revolutionary Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, when he pointed out in one of the many passages of Adam Smith that somehow don't appear in the readings, that although mercantilism and colonialism were terrible things and very harmful, grievous impact on the colonies and quite harmful to the people of England, the principal architect, the merchants and the financiers, who were the principal architects of policy with regard to them, he said their interests were most peculiarly attended to. In other words, they did very nicely. The guys who made up the policy, so in other words, the policies that we're supposed to hate were very good for the guys on top in England, and that's why they were instituted, and they harmed everybody else in England, he claimed. Maybe so. That's one of the ways in which the poor subsidize the rich in the rich societies. And nothing changes until today. If we just, it's getting late, so I'll just mention a few things, but there are some major tendencies in the world economy reflecting these facts. It's not just that the rich do what, the rich countries pursue policies on the basis of what's in it for us, meaning we cast out market discipline if we don't like it, and we force market discipline on others, and we construct for them a kind of democracy in which is top-down and under control of people who will serve our interests. It's not that the rich countries do that. Exactly the same thing goes on internal to the countries. And you can see it happening very visibly and very dramatically in the rich countries in the United States right now, particularly since 1970. Around then, there really was a major change in world order. It's a very significant one. And a lot of important things have happened since then, and NAFTA fits into this, so let me go on. Since about 1970, the United States had been the sort of, kind of world banker up until then. There was an international economic system, the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. was the guarantor of it, given our enormous wealth. By about then, the U.S. couldn't handle it any longer. Other major centers of power. We were still by far the richest, but Japan, the Japanese system, and European system were competitors. The guys who run the thing, who run the game, decide on the rules. So President Nixon decided to throw out the rules. The Bretton Woods system was dismantled unilaterally by the United States in the early 1970s. And that had a lot of consequences. Other things happened at the same time, but without talking about the details, one of the consequences was a huge increase in the amount of unregulated capital in the world. I mean, it's just extraordinary. The most recent World Bank estimate, again just a few days ago, is $14 trillion of unregulated capital. I haven't the foggiest idea what that number means, incidentally. I tell it to you, but I don't know what it means. $14 trillion, but I do know one thing about it. $14 trillion of unregulated capital means that the countries of the world do what they're told by international finance. So national banks in countries, means European countries, not poor countries, can't defend their own currencies. The European monetary system just collapsed because it couldn't withstand the attack of unregulated international capital. It's an open question whether even the rich country like the United States could withstand that pressure. Probably not, as many expect, I think. Certainly third world countries haven't got a chance. So there's this huge amount of completely unregulated capital, very narrowly concentrated, like it's not that, the folks you run into in the street own it. And it's quite international. It goes anywhere it likes. With modern telecommunications, you can shift the currencies larger than the total reserves of some big country from one place to another in about 2 minutes, and so on and so forth. That's one change. A second major change that has taken place in the last 20 years is a very sharp increase in the internationalization of production. It's connected with this. It means it's a lot easier to move production to high repression, low wage areas. Places like those diamond cutters in India. Much easier to do that, and to do it for big manufacturing as well. That's connected with the easy flow of capital and the easy availability of it. In fact, that has reached such a point that, again, in a recent World Bank study, foreign sales of transnational corporations are now estimated to hold about a third of total productive assets. And the foreign sales of transnational corporations are now considerably greater than all of world trade. So if you add up what Ford is selling abroad and so on, that number dominates world trade by a considerable factor at this point. This is a radical shift in what's happening in the world. Furthermore, what's called world trade is itself a bit of a joke. Something like maybe a third or 40%, something around that, of world trade is actually not trade at all. It's just intra-firm transactions. It's one branch of the Ford Motor Company moving something from one place to another and happening to cross a border. So that has nothing more to do with trade than if you own a grocery store and you move a can of beans from one shelf to another. It just happens by accident to cross a border. Now, those are not small numbers. That's estimated, as I say, well over a third of world trade. And that aside, even this phony notion of trade is itself dominated by foreign sales of transnational corporations. Furthermore, a third major point is that with this huge increase in international capital, what it's being used for has shifted radically. back around 1970, about 90% of it, it's estimated, was used for foreign exchange, was used for long-term investment and trade, sort of productive things. 10% was used for speculation. Those figures seem to have approximately reversed. It seems now that about 90% is used for speculation and about 10% for long-term investment and trade. And many economists have suggested that these various things that I've described are what lie behind some very important developments that have taken place in the international economy in the last 20 years. For one thing, there's been a sharp slowdown of economic growth all over the world, much lower than it was. Secondly, national economic planning is becoming virtually impossible because of speculative attacks and internationalization of production. And third, the third world model is coming home. So as you shift production abroad, trying to compete with those starving diamond cutters in India, or Mexican workers who are not going to get jobs from NAFTA. In fact, they're going to be flooded. In fact, they'll probably end up with lower wages because part of this arrangement will wipe out agricultural producers who won't be able to withstand what in effect are highly subsidized U.S. agribusinesses. Millions of them will flood to the cities. That gives you a huge labor market. The government's repressive enough so that it won't, you try to organize a union, you get killed. So maybe they'll have jobs, but it'll be like these Indian workers. Well, that's what happens, but of course it comes home as well, because the people in the rich countries who are trying to compete with them, they're driven down to that level. You're not getting harmonization. You might get a kind of harmonization of global standards, but it's harmonization downward under these conditions, not upwards. And under deflationary, non-stimulative, kind of low-growth equilibrium, which turns the whole world more and more into a sort of a two-tiered third-world style society. American workers, for example, are becoming essentially superfluous for production. And they're also probably, although this is an open question, they might be becoming superfluous for consumption. In the days of a more national economy, say like the 1920s, Henry Ford understood that if he wants to sell his cars, he better pay his workers, $5 a day. Otherwise, nobody's going to buy his cars. It's not so clear that that's still necessary in a more internationalized economy of the kind that I just described. The answer isn't in on that one. It may very well be possible, and that's certainly the direction we're going, to have internationalized production seeking the most highly repressed, lowest wage workers anywhere and orienting the production towards wealthy sectors around the world. Ford World Car. The production is going to the rich, who in the rich countries are a fairly substantial number, and in the poor countries are a very small number, but they're all over the place, and they may turn out to be the market, in which case you get exactly what you see when you take a walk in any American city. You see South Central Los Angeles, or downtown Boston. People who are basically superfluous. It's not on the scale yet of the favelas around Rio or, the slums around Cairo and so on. But the phenomenon is quite visibly growing. You can't miss it. You see it everywhere. And you all know it, so I won't go on with it. Furthermore, the guys in charge are quite aware of it and very happy about it. The Wall Street Journal, for example, had a front page article a couple of days ago in which they discussed some new statistics that had come along, which they said are of transcendent importance. Not a little thing. What's of transcendent importance is that thanks to the attack on labor in the last 10 years and the partial marketization of American society, meaning the poor play the market game, the rich have the state to protect them, the usual double-edged sword. Thanks to this, they said U.S. wages have now fallen below every other country in the industrial world, with the sole exception of England. Margaret Thatcher managed to do even a little better than we did. And that's really good, we're the richest, most privileged country in the world, incredible advantages, and we've succeeded in getting wages driven down lower than any of our competitors, except England. Not quite down to the level of South Korea and Taiwan yet, they said. They're kind of trying, keep after. And those are quite natural consequences of these general long-term tendencies. So the diamond cutters may starve to death in India, and hundreds of thousands of children may starve to death in Brazil, but people here are going to be starving too. And in fact, if you check cities like, say, Boston, a rich city with big medical center, the Boston City Hospital, which caters to the general public, was forced to set up a malnutrition clinic a couple of years ago that treats third world levels of malnutrition and has to use triage, because they don't have enough resources. The problem, they say, becomes much worse in the winter when parents have to make that agonizing choice between food for your children and, heat for your home, so they get more of it. Well, we're going to see more and more of that because it's a kind of like a natural consequence of these policies. Markets for the poor, state power for the rich. It's an old story, but it's taken on quite new forms in the last years. Again, the business world is very clear about it. They're highly class conscious. They know exactly what they're doing. And fortunately, they write about it, so you don't have to make it up. They tell you. You read the business press, it's right there. Take, say, General Motors. We've already achieved this result of transcendent importance, but we want to go further. So let's take the biggest corporation in the U.S., General Motors. Well, as you know, they're planning to close down 24 plants in the United States. They're already the biggest employer in Mexico, where they get very cheap and highly repressed workers who can't organize and so on, and a lot of people flooding from the farms will, take their places. But that's not enough. They want to go somewhere even better. So they're now starting to open up, to move plants to the new third world that's opening up thanks to the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War offers new weapons against Western working people, and it's well understood. It's this big new third world opening up. So GM, for example, has a new $700 billion plant in East Germany. And if you look at the Financial Times, the world's best financial newspaper, they're very happy about it. They say they can get workers for 40% the wages of the pampered West European workers. In Poland, thanks to harsh government repression and market principles, they have what is called an economic miracle. And the people in Poland somehow can't seem to understand it, so they just voted the communists back in. But the West likes it, and they'll follow it anyway. It doesn't matter who they vote in, because they're subject to these forces anyway. But now you can get really cheap workers there, well-trained, educated. They also have the advantage of being blue-eyed and blonde, so you don't have to worry about that stuff. I was talking about East Germany, sorry. Poland is even better. They have a plant I skipped the stage. They have a plant in East Germany where they get them at 40% of the wages of the pampered Western European workers, but then they open a new plant in Poland where they can get them for 10% of the pampered Western European workers. That's described in an article in the Financial Times with the title, "Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins," meaning communism's a wreck, but there's some really nice things going on there. There's some green shoots coming along, like the fact that you can get workers for 10% of the wages of the pampered West European workers, and furthermore, the government has heavily repressive policies, so they'll keep them down, they have a state, which crushes them because that's what the market economics tells you got to do. And that's great, so we have some green shoots there. And they describe why. Here's the description. They say, with the market reforms that are being instituted in Poland have led to pauperization of the workforce. Okay, they've led to pauperization of the workforce and large-scale unemployment, which makes it a great labor market. Finish in a second. Because you don't have to worry about these pampered West European workers anymore. Business Week picked it up and said, they taught the lesson. You got to end the luxurious social programs. That's the phrase that Western workers have been used to. Like they get vacations and food and all that sort of thing, and they got to live like the guys who we can grind into the dust. In the third world. That's the goal. In brief, without going on, the idea is to put the screws on the poor abroad, as you always did, but now put the screws much more than you could before on the poor at home. You can do it both. That's one of the consequences of internationalization of labor. Well, that's a few words. I'm supposed to talk about NAFTA. I'll say one word about it. As I mentioned, NAFTA has a North American free trade agreement would be worth discussing. But the only thing in NAFTA that has to do with the North American Free Trade Agreement is the words North American. It's not free and it's not trade. It's highly protectionist. About 10% of the NAFTA, those 2,000 pages, are devoted to very complicated rules of origin conditions, which give all sorts of advantages to what they call North American-based, meaning U.S.-based corporations. They can sort of beat up their rivals in Asia and Europe, and of course they'll drive them to setting up regional systems as well, which will harm the workers, but aren't going to harm the corporations, because, you know, like Xerox Corp or Zenith. I heard a guy from Zenith the other day on NPR talking about how fantastic NAFTA was because it was going to be so protectionist, you know, we'll keep out the Europeans and the Japanese, and of course sooner or later the Europeans and the Japanese will retaliate, and that'll harm the workers in North America, but it's not going to harm him because he already has factories inside those systems. That's the meaning of the transnationalization of production. So you just get another device for beating down the poor in the rich societies as well as in the poor societies. Quite apart from that, NAFTA is highly protectionist in other ways. Hilda mentioned intellectual property rights. That's an extremely important matter. That's a U.S. initiative, both in NAFTA and GATT, and it means raising protectionist barriers to ensure that the technology of the future, meaning the profits of the future, is protected, is monopolized by U.S. corporations. And those are no small things. I mean, the U.S. International Trade Commission, U.S. agency, estimates that could cost the third world about $60 billion a year if these rights are instituted in GATT, as they already are in NAFTA. But that's protectionism. I mean, like the U.S. never accepted such rules when it was a developing society, nor has any other country like Germany or Japan, or I mean, nobody ever dreamt of that. But now we're on top, right? So therefore, we ran it down their throats. We want to force India to not to be able to produce drugs at, say, 10% the cost of American drugs. Rather, their children have to die of diseases, or else somehow those diamond workers have to figure out how to buy our super expensive drugs, which are subsidized by things like the MIT biology lab, where the research is done, and then, you know, you get the profits go off to the pharmaceutical companies, if there are any. I won't go on, but if you go through it point by point, you find it's a highly protectionist system. It's designed to protect investor rights, not workers' rights, not the rights of future generations. It's called the environment. It's a special system designed to protect the rights of investors, a kind of a mixture of liberalization and protectionism, carefully geared to investor rights. It's got nothing to do with the free trade agreement. Neither free, as I say, nor trade. I mean, it's talking about services, meaning putting banks in third world countries, nothing to do with trade. Patents has nothing to do with trade. These are just further ways of crushing, of seeing what's in it for us, where us, now we understand, means the principal architects of policy in Adam Smith's sense, that is, the guys who run the rich societies. They ask what's in it for us, and they got a whole lot of new mechanisms to achieve their goals. Well, there is a fundamental question. The question is, how far can this go? How far will it really be possible to construct an international society on what is in effect the third world model, that is, islands of wealth and, you know, sea of misery, and to do it within a kind of a totalitarian system? Because notice that all these systems of control are immune to public influence and knowledge. You cannot know what's going inside a transnational corporation, nor what's going on inside their institutions, like the IMF or GATT or G7, you know, executive agreements. All secret. You've got the ultimate move in destruction of democracy. Not only does it probably have no influence on the decisions that are being made, they don't even know about them. That was what was so symbolic about keeping NAFTA secret. You know, totally secret, obviously important. Nobody knew, kept secret. Well, that's the way the new governing institutions work, corporations in law and principle, and the new organizations that are growing up around them, in fact. So will it be possible to set up a world in which you have, in effect, a kind of, you know, a deep kind of totalitarianism, maybe under an electoral facade, you know, so the kind of democracy that Carruthers talks about in Central America we could keep here too, Or will popular resistance, which increasingly is going to have to be international in scale, so it's going to have to be Mexican and Americans together working on these things, just as the enemy is international, will it be able to somehow dismantle these evolving systems of domination and violence? Those seem to me the really big questions for the future. Thanks.